Sunsets, renowned for their amazing beauty, nearly perfect weather year round, and unbelievable beaches. Hawaii is true paradise. But just beyond the wondrous vistas and endless sun, the islands hold a dark past. One that's often defined by race and the ever present footprint of the United States military. Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick, and with me is my Kua'ualua, the unqualified and unapologetic Kimberly. So, Kim, are you ready to jump back to 1930s pre statehood Hawaii for the story of three crimes? Well, for sure, one crime, at least two trials, and we'll leave you asking questions about the legal and political systems in a territory on the edge of an American empire.
Nothing says paradise like peeling back the postcard to find racism, power, and a legal system doing Olympic level mental gymnastics. Let's go. Sunsets on the outside, systematic injustice on the inside.
Without going into much detail, we have to start with a brief look at how Hawaii became American territory in the first place.
All right, this is officially the boring history part and where I lovingly tap out. I'll return when there's crime, chaos, or at least a scandal. I'm going to step out, grab a snack, and emotionally prepare to rejoin once we get back to the crime.
All right, so while Kim steps out to get her snack, I'm going to go into a little bit of the whole history of Hawaii, just a brief overview. If you're not terribly interested, fast forward a few minutes. Hawaii was an independent kingdom prior to 1893. Sugar was what caused Europeans and Americans to become so interested in the islands. Quickly, plantations popped up on the major islands, and the plantation owners gained greater and greater control of the Hawaiian economy. The presence of American born planters grew in the island nation. Those foreign born planters started to demand fair representation in the Hawaiian government. Now, of course, by fair, they meant that they should have greater control. The United States, drunk on the concept of manifest destiny, wanted to expand its influence in Asia and the Pacific. A foothold in the Central Pacific could give the United States better opportunities in Oceania and Southeast Asia. Like the United States really needs to get involved in Southeast Asia. I guess we'll learn that lesson later. The United States in 1873 offered to exchange free tax importation of sugar to America in exchange for Ford Island, located in Pearl Harbor. Discussion continued for years until finally in 1887, the United States gained a lease to all of Pearl Harbor for military and commercial use. Now, permanent U.S. military presence emboldened the non native Hawaiians to rebel. A group of primarily whites launched a coup and forced the quote, Bayonet Constitution on Hawaii. This established a type of constitutional monarchy. This, of course, was not enough for the mostly American and European plantation owners. Queen Lulakalani in 1893 made a move to restore some power to the monarchy in exchange for greater voting rights to Native Hawaiians, while white businessmen and planners formed something called the Committee of Safety and declared martial law and started a coup d'etat aimed at removing the Queen from power. The key to their success was gaining the support of the American diplomats who ordered sailors and Marines to aid the rebels. The Queen, most likely wanting to avoid bloodshed and armed conflict with the United States, commanded her forces to stand down the Committee of Safety named Stanford Dole. That's right, a pineapple guy, as president. Back in the United States, the government launched an investigation into the role American forces played in the revolution, concluding that they had, surprise, surprise, abused their power and were responsible for the change in government. But the United States made no move to return Hawaii to the Hawaiians. Instead, the United States started to move towards requiring the islands for themselves. And on the 7th of July, 1898, the United States officially annexed the Hawaiian territory with Stanford Dole as its governor. For Hawaiian natives, Japanese, and Chinese laborers, they were now part of a country deeply rooted in the policies of Jim Crow, racial segregation, and oppression. Okay, so maybe we actually have four crimes here if you count the theft of an entire island chain. As the 20th century moved forward, the United States military presence in Hawaii increased, as did the clash between whites and non white Hawaiians. One thing that might have made these conflicts a little different than other racial conflicts in the United States was by the early 20th century, whites could and did serve on juries in Hawaii. This would give Native Hawaiians and Asians accused by whites a fighting chance in court. Outside the courtrooms, well, that was a different story. So, when a woman claimed to have been assaulted by five Hawaiian men, the island braced for possible violence. On the night of the 12th of September, 1931, Talia Massey and her husband Tommy geared up for a night out with his naval buddies. By most accounts, Talia was not thrilled to spend another night out with heavy drinking sailors, but also was not keen on the idea of staying home alone. According to many sources, that theirs was not a happy marriage. She often walked out of his Navy get togethers. This caused friction because it was known that this socializing was part of getting promoted. But she went along on this day as they began drinking at home before the party moved to the nightclub near Waikiki. It was Navy night, and for 50 cents, they could dance all night until the club closed at 1 a.m. As the night played out, Talia became frustrated that Tommy paid more attention to his drinking buddies than her. Things heated up when the crew's skipper left the restroom only to return and find Talia in his seat. The officer demanded that she get out of his seat. She refused, and the skipper reportedly called her a louse. Pretty nasty insult in the 1930s. This was apparently much harsher than she was willing to put up with because she slapped the officer across the face. Tommy was called over to calm the situation down, and let's be honest, it was 1931, so it was more likely to put his woman in her place. It seems that Talia wasn't going to deal with it anymore, so just before midnight, she left the club and was seen walking towards the beach. Around 1 a.m., Talia flagged down a passing car. Passengers in the car recalled that Talia's face and lips looked swollen, and she had a gash on her cheeks. They also noted that her clothes seemed oddly in good condition. She was offered a ride to the hospital, but refused and asked to be taken home instead.
I've rejoined the conversation. Something terrible is about to happen, and that's really why we're all here.
Shortly after rising home, Talia answered the phone call. It was Tommy calling from a friend's house, possibly checking in to see if Talia had made it home okay or just letting you know that he was going to be out a little longer. Something awful has happened. Come home, Talia told Tommy. When he returned home, she told him a horrible story. She had been sexually assaulted by a gang of five Hawaiians. At almost that exact same time that Talia was flagging down that car, Agnes Peoples was being assaulted. Agnes had reported that she had been in a near accident in a downtown intersection. In an apparent altercation that followed the near miss, a young Hawaiian man hit her. Agnes was left with a bloody ear and a license plate number 58 985. 1 hour after receiving the complaint from Agnes, the police got a call from Tommy Massey. His wife had been the victim of a gang rape.
I knew something awful was coming.
Detectives were sent to the Massey home. Talia told how she had been attacked by 4 or 5 Hawaiians. It was impossible for her to give a description of her perpetrators, but she knew they were Hawaiians by, quote, the sounds of their voice. She was dragged to the bushes and raped 6 or 7 times before the perpetrators left in a dark colored car. She said she never saw the plates. She was asked numerous times about the plates, but each time she stated it was too dark and she never saw the plates. The attacks on 2 women coming so close together, detectives assumed that both attacks had to be the work of the same gang. Police started with the information they had on the car involved in the People's assault. A light gray Model A Ford registered to an unmarried Japanese woman living in, and you'll love this name, Hell's Half Acre. If that doesn't give it away, it was a poor neighborhood of Honolulu. Police determined that the lady's son, Horace Ida, had been driving the car that night. Ida was taken in for questioning in both cases.
So the evidence is thin, the conclusions are big, and the suspect is poor and not white. Got it.
Little familiar, yes. Meanwhile, Talia was taken to the hospital for a medical examination. After the exam, a nurse made the comment that Talia was, quote, clean as a new pin. It is unclear exactly what she meant by this, but based on trial testimony, it would seem that there was no physical signs of trauma or semen present. Talia now recalled getting a look at the license plate after all. She said the number was 58 905. To the police, there was no way this could be a coincidence. The plate was just one digit off of Ida's. To the detectives, it was confirmation the two crimes were committed by the same persons. Only later was it discovered that in Massey's group of supporters, some people had heard the plate number broadcast over police radios, and a detective had shared the plate number with a friend of Tommy's before Talia gave her information. A later investigation, known as the Pinkerton Report, would show that she was exposed to the plate number numerous times before giving her report. To say the investigation went off the rails at this point is an understatement. Ida was brought into the room with Talia, not a lineup, just a victim and suspect face to face. Detective McIntosh looked at Ida and said, "Now look at your beautiful work." Ida was then pulled in for intense questioning. Believing he was only looking at charges for the incident involving Peoples, he gave the name of four friends who had been driving with him that night. Now, I'm going to apologize up front for these butchering of these names. Ben Ahakulo, Henry Chang, David Taki, and Joe Kayahawai. Each of the men were in turn round up and brought in for questioning. McIntosh, believing he had the right suspects, suggested that another detective take Ida's car and drive back and forth through the mud near the reported location of the attack on Talia.
Oh, absolutely not. No lineup, no counsel, just trauma and coercion. That's not an investigation. That's intimidation. Yeah, this is completely off the rails.
Meanwhile, at the hospital, Talia was examined by Dr. David Liu. The examination could not confirm nor deny sexual assault. It's important to note, though, that Talia would have been at home for over an hour before telling anyone of the attack, and it's likely she tried to clean herself up before talking to anyone. If she did this, then it is possible that evidence of the sexual assault was lost. It was, however, determined that she did have a broken jaw that would later need surgery. It was also at this time that Talia said the name Joe and Bull came up during the attack. News of the attack spread quickly. Hawaii's white population became enraged. The attack on a white woman by a gang of Hawaiians and Asians confirmed their most vile racial hysterics. The commander of the Naval District, Admiral Sterling, called for the accused to be, quote, strung up on trees. The Honolulu Advisor, owned by whites, ran a story under the headline Gang Assault Young Wife. The story told how a refined woman of, quote, highest character was attacked by a gang of fiends. This prompted a group of white businessmen to offer a $5,000 reward for anyone who could come up with evidence leading to a conviction.
Once the press, the military, and money lined up like this, there was never going to be a fair outcome. The crime stops being about justice and becomes about race.
The case against the five men looks solid. There is just one issue: the timeline. Detectives and the prosecution had a hard time figuring out how the suspects could have had the time to rape Talia. Between 11:35 and midnight, most likely closer to midnight, Talia leaves the club walking towards the beach. Between 12:05 and 12:10, numerous witnesses placed the five suspects at a parking lot outside a different dance club. The club had closed at midnight. Between 12:05 and 12:15, Talia is seen by several witnesses walking with a white man down John Edna Road. At sometime between 12:15 and 12:20, the suspects are seen driving over 6 miles away from the scene of the attack. At 12:30, the suspects stop at the home of Wilhelmina Carina's, but leave one, shortly once they realized the party at the house had broken up. It was at 12:35 to 12:40 that Agnes Peoples and the suspects had an altercation at an intersection that was 10 minutes away from the crime scene. At 12:45, Peoples made her report to the Honolulu police. At 12:50, Talia was picked up by a passing car and driven home. At 1:47, Tommy calls the police and reports his wife's assault by, quote, a man. Police arrive within the hour. She now reports being raped by 4 or 5 men. At 2:50, police, using the plate provided by Peoples, arrest Horicida. At 3:30, Talia tells the police the plate of the car driven by her attackers is 58-905. This after having heard the plate on the police radio and having heard officers discussing it.
Yeah, this case collapses the moment you read it out loud.
This timeline created serious issues for the prosecution of the 5 suspects. At the time of the attack, they were seen by multiple eyewitnesses, first at a house party, then at an accident, both miles from the location of the assault. There's also the white man that was seen walking down John Edna Road just before the attack. That was never followed up on. Princess Keawana no Koa, the last member of Hawaii's former monarchy, was able to get William H. Heen, Hawaii's only Democratic state senator at the time, to take on the 5 defendants in this case. After interviewing the men, Heen was convinced of their innocence.
Funny how innocence becomes clearer once someone finally asks questions.
On the mainland and the white owned Hawaiian newspapers, the suspects were painted as fiends and a gang. They were all also misidentified as all being Hawaiian. Of the 5, only 2 were Hawaiian, 2 were Japanese ancestry, and 1 was Chinese Hawaiian ancestry. The press had dubbed the case the Alamona rape case and left little doubt about the suspect's guilt. The trial would open on the 16th of November, 1931, in what seemed like a very progressive move for the 1930s. The defense and prosecution agreed on a mixed race jury: 2 Japanese Americans, 2 Chinese Americans, 3 Hawaiians, and 5 whites. Talia Massey was the first to testify for the prosecution. The story she told started with her leaving the club around 11:35 and walking for 15 to 20 minutes before the suspects picked her up. She said 2 men jumped out of the car, then Kalahawai came up from behind and struck her in the jaw. She was shoved in the car and then driven to the spot of the assault. She said she spent about 20 minutes at the scene after being dragged from the car. The defense went easy on Talia in cross examination, not wanting to look like they were browbeating a victim, but they did ask about how her story changed and when now suddenly being able to identify the defendants and the plate. She had originally stated it was too dark to see the faces or the plate, but later identified Ida and Kahawai. She stated that she didn't remember ever saying that she couldn't see the faces or the plate. The defense didn't push the issue out of the fear of backlash.
That's a very specific story for something she originally said she couldn't see.
Police testified that the tire tracks in the scene were similar to the car driven by Ida that night. The defense was able to call into question the officer's expertise on tire tracks. Talia's identification at the hospital was introduced into evidence. Detective McIntosh delivered what the prosecution hoped would be the gotcha moment when he told how Talia had recalled the license plate, only off by 1 digit. Then the prosecution rested. While the defense never suggested that Talia was not raped, her injuries showed that she had been beaten that night. They did ask Dr. John Porter if it was possible for her to be raped by 4 to 6 men and not leave any evidence. The doctor gave a pretty worthless answer of maybe, maybe not. Then they produced a parade of witnesses to testify to the location of the defendants at key points in the night. A couple also testified to seeing Talia or at least someone that looked like her wearing the same dress, walking down John Edna Road, followed by a white man. Witnesses were able to bring into question Talia's memory. A detective even testified that she had stated that she couldn't see the faces or the plate because it was too dark. Then, in what would seem like a major blow to the prosecution, Detective Sato reported that he and McIntosh had driven Ida's car back and forth across the crime scene before the tire experts came to testify about the tire tracks. Not questioning the attack on Talia, the defense closed by saying the police and the DA had framed the victims, while the prosecution called on the jury to vindicate Hawaii and to protect your women. The jury deliberated for 96 hours. The final vote was 6-6. When the foreman reported that the jury was hopelessly deadlocked on the 6th of December, 1931, a mistrial was declared.
96 hours. And even the jury couldn't make this story make sense. 6-6. Exactly as broken as the case is.
Of course, things went nuts after the mistrial. Taya's mother, Grace Orescu, tried to get the judge to keep the defendants in jail, but the judge said without evidence of guilt, he couldn't do that. Fortescue and Admiral Sterling tried to get the territorial governor to intervene, but were again told that without evidence, it's unlikely there'd be a conviction. Grace then started the plan to take things into her own hands. Police responded to a number of fights between whites and non whites in the next coming days. The papers added to the tension with the headlines, "The Shame of Honolulu," above a story that warned now women would be raped by, quote, gangs of lust mad youths.
That isn't journalism, that's incitement. And it's teaching people exactly what to fear and who.
Horace Ida was kidnapped with a revolver stuck in his ribs. He was dragged off in a car full of sailors. They took him to a remote cliffside, stripped him of his shirt, and whipped him. Then he was beaten, kicked, and pistol whipped. A passenger car coming by found him by the side of the road and took him to the police station where he was reported as, quote, lucky to be alive. At the same time, rumors started to circulate. One was that Tommy had beaten Talia after discovering she had sex with another sailor. He was advised to leave the islands but refused. He said he wanted to stay and clear his wife's names. A second rumor was that Ida, while being beaten, had confessed to the sailors. This seems unlikely because they didn't hang him, which is what they probably would have done if he confessed.
When facts are inconvenient, rumors step in. None of this is evidence. Rumors are an unofficial currency of a moral panic.
Her name now.
Fortescue.
Yeah.
To start at the beginning.
An attorney friend of Tommy's told he and Fortescue, I'm going to butcher that name again, that a conviction would only be possible with a confession. Two issues seem to stand in the way, according to the attorney. First, the lack of physical evidence. Second, it wasn't legal in Hawaii to keep non whites off the jury. It was widely believed that the non whites on the jury were the reason for the hung jury. They also were told that a confession under torture wouldn't hold up in court, so it would be important that no marks or bruises be evident. Tommy and Fortescue plotted to grab one of the suspects and convince them to talk. It was believed that Joe Kaawahi would be the easiest to crack. Others would say he was targeted because he had the darkest complexion of the five. So the husband and mother in law duo focused their plan on him. Kaawahi had to report daily at 8 a.m. to his probation officer in the Judiciary Building in downtown Honolulu. Tommy, dressed as a chauffeur, drove a black rented Buick with a soldier named Deacon Jones to the Officiary Building. Jones had been recruited as muscle for the kidnapping. Fortescue and a second soldier, Edward Lord, followed in a second car. As Kahawaii left the Judiciary Building, Jones grabbed him by the arm and waved a poorly made copy of a summons in his face. The summons, full of misspellings, a glued on gold foil sticker from some paperwork one of the soldiers had gotten for taking part in a chemical warfare class, wasn't going to fool anybody. And Kawahi most likely didn't get a good look at it. If he had, he probably would have noticed that the summons from Commander Ross of the Territorial Police had misspelled territorial, looked mostly handwritten except for the random clipping from a newspaper that has nothing to do with the case, and a gold foil sticker that was glued onto it from Tommy's diploma from chemical warfare school. What Kawahi's intention was probably focused on was the 32 caliber Colt pistol that Jones had shoved in his gut. Kawahi was shoved into the Buick and taken to the rented home of Forsescu in mm, the Manoa Valley. Both cars were parked out front, and the suspect, turned kidnapping victim, was taken inside and tied up.
Okay, history, crime, rumors, repeat. My attention span officially checked out, but I'll stick around for when something actually happens.
Kawahi's cousin had witnessed the abduction and reported it immediately. Police were told to be on the lookout for a large, dark Buick in connection to the kidnapping of Joe Kawahi. At 10:20, Detective George Harbottle spotted a dark Buick driven by a woman with two male passengers and the back shade pulled down. Now, it took me a second to figure this out, but some older cars actually had shades to cover their windows. Thank 1930 safety or privacy glass. Harbottle followed the car as it sped along the coastal highway. Realizing they were being followed, the Buick sped up. So Harbottle and a second police officer were conducting a high speed chase, including an attempt to shoot out the Buick's tires. Finally, Harbottle was able to pull alongside and force the fleeing car from the road. The detective approached with his gun out, seeing blood-soaked bedsheet tied with rope in the back seat. He placed Tommy Massey, Grace Forchescu, and Edward Lloyd under arrest. In no time, police arrived at the home of Grace Forchescu to find Deacon Jones drinking a glass of whiskey, standing in a room that he had been cleaning of blood. They were able to gather evidence from the car and the house. The body of Joe Kahawahi, beaten, shot, blood soaked sheets, towels, ropes, guns, buttons off of Kawahi's underclothes. News of the arrest spread like lightning. Admiral Sterling, not wanting Forsescu, Tommy, and the soldiers to stay in jail, arranged with the governor to have them moved to the USS Alton, anchored offshore in Pearl Harbor. Without spending one night behind bars, they were put up in quarters, not the brig, but quarters aboard the Alton. To many aboard the Alton and newspapers across the United States, the four were heroes and the murder and honor killing, while the NAACP said that it was the only lynching thus far in 1932. The people of Hawaii were divided, mainly on racial lines. While newspapers and whites defended the killing of non whites, mourned Kauahi as the victim of a racist system. His funeral drew thousands of mourners, only surpassed by that of Hawaii's Queen Lulakalani.
They don't even see a cell. They're on a ship, living like heroes, while the man who actually died barely gets a headline. That's classy.
A grand jury was convened, presented with overwhelming evidence. The 21-person grand jury seemed to lean a little towards not indicting them. Judge Albert Christie instructed the jury that they were not a trial jury, but their job was to determine if there was enough credible evidence to put the defendants on trial. After deliberation, the foreman reported a vote of 12 to 9 not to indict. Christie, clearly not happy, called the jury back in the courtroom. He told them how in a civilized society survives on the rule of law. He told them to put aside any racial prejudice they might have, to ignore their inner feelings, that the evidence clearly shows a crime was committed and the defendants were most likely involved. Finally, a majority of the grand jury came around to Christie's way of thinking and they voted 12 to 8 to indict. If the case couldn't draw more attention, Clarence Darrow decided to come out of retirement to get involved. Darrow was seen as a very progressive on issues of race, so it was a shock when he signed on to defend four whites accused of killing a Japanese American. Darrow, who had lost a lot of money in the crash in 1929, later admitted three things caused him to take the case. First, the money. He was going to be paid $30,000, or the equivalent of 710,000 in 2026 money. Second, he and his wife had always wanted to see Hawaii. Lastly, he was fascinated by the psychology of the case. It would be his last trial case.
The last case of Clarence Darrow's career, bought with cash, inspired by travel plans, and curiosity about human behavior.
Evidence left little doubt that the four were responsible for the murder. Under felony murder law, the prosecution didn't have to prove who pulled the trigger, though they believed it was Jones, and Jones would actually later admit to shooting Kawahi because he had, quote, no use for him. They all they had to do was show that each played a role in the killing, and they would all be equally as guilty. The trial started. Judge Christie was removed as a trial judge. The defense made a motion that Christie was prejudiced based on his pushing for an indictment. Christie voluntarily removed himself. The prosecution's case was strong. They presented an eyewitness to the kidnapping, a mountain of physical evidence, the gun, photos of blood on Forsescu's floor, coroner's reports, police testimony, bloody sheets, rope found in Forsescu's home that matched the rope on Kahawai's body. The jury was even made to handle Kawahi's bloody shirt. Then they closed by calling his mother to identify the blood-stained clothing.
They laid it all out: witness, blood, rope, shirt, testimony. Everything points one way. But you know how this story goes.
Mm. Clarence Darrow figured he'd have to present some type of mitigating factors, like possibly insanity. He would bring psychiatrists in from the mainland to testify in the case. He called Tommy Massie to the stand and asked him about the night of September 12th. Tommy told the story of going to the club, Talia leaving, coming home to find her crying, and telling him about the attack. Tommy was still on the stand when the court adjourned for the day. Court was canceled the next day as Darrow reportedly was ill, although others claim he was hungover from celebrating his night on the island. When Tommy started the next day of testimony, Darrow questioned him about the day of the killing. Tommy admitted to taking Kalawahi to Forsescu's home and questioning him. They questioned him, but he kept denying the accusations of rape. He said he grabbed the .32 semi-automatic pistol of Jones when finally Kalawahi broke and admitted to the rape. The following is from the transcript. Darrow, go ahead, tell the whole story. You know your gang was there. Tommy, yes, we done it. Darrow, did you have the gun in your hand when you were talking to him? Tommy, yes, sir. Darrow, do you remember what you did? Tommy, no, sir. Darrow, do you remember what became of the gun? Tommy, no, sir. Darrow, do you remember what became of you? Tommy, no, sir. The psychiatrist testified that Tommy was temporarily insane at the time of the killing. In his closing, Darrow would claim that if the person who pulled the trigger was insane at the time of the killing, then all the defendants would have to be acquitted. He painted the defendants as victims out for justice that had been denied by the courts.
Confession, amnesia, temporary insanity. That defense does not work.
The jury returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter. It carried a sentence of 10 years. But the territorial governor commuted the sentence to 1 hour to be served in his office at Loani Palace.
Of course.
The governor asked the FBI to review the case against the now four suspects in the Massey rape case. The FBI refused. The governor brought in the Pinkerton Detective Agency, not known for having the most progressive stance on anything. The review of the evidence and witness testimony, and they concluded that the kidnapping and rape of Talia Massi was not caused by those accused. All charges against the remaining four were dropped. Now, at a minimum, somebody broke Talia Massi's jaw. Horace Ida was kidnapped and beaten. Joe Kawahi was brutally murdered, and no one faced any real justice. Likely the real culprit of all three crimes were actually hailed as heroes because I at least believe that Tommy or another sailor was who had assaulted Talia that night. The crimes would change Hawaiian society. People were emboldened to speak out against business oligarchy that controlled the islands. Hawaiian, Japanese, and Chinese citizens came to see that they had a common interest more important than their ethnic divisions. Non whites started to vote in record numbers, changing the makeup of the territorial legislature to be more representative of the Hawaiian people. So maybe a little good came from a whole lot of bad. This has been History is Criminal. Join Kim and I next week as we take a look at colonial Massachusetts and a trial that would show why separation of church and state is such a good thing. Until then, if you like what you heard, tell a friend, and if not, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.